Hello and welcome. Today we're going further in our consideration of the organizations and the followers of the far right populism, and the psychology and the ethnography of the people who have emerged as followers of far right extremist organizations. So we've got kind of a working definition of the far right. It involves themes of nationalism, xenophobia, racism, white supremacy, intolerance, and authoritarianism. These are the attributes which we're thinking of when we identify an organization or a movement as being extreme far right. And as we've seen, the far right exists in many countries, almost every European country, the United Kingdom, most Latin American countries, and as we know from our own history and current politics, the United States. So our question for today, and the readings that you've done for today, is about the followers. Who are the followers? How are they recruited? How are they mobilized as activists? And why do they follow? Are there demographic features that they have in common, whether of gender, of class, of race, and so on? Are there distinctive and identifiable recruitment methods which are used in a variety of countries and cities to try to mobilize people, and especially young people, to follow the extremist far-right organizations which are emerging? This last question about recruitment is a really important one because it's very possible for individuals to have some of the motivations which might make them followers, but if they're not triggered through some kind of recruitment mechanism, then they're not likely to get involved. So what are the mechanisms through which new adherents are recruited to right-wing extremist organizations? What are the psychological and emotional mechanisms that are in play that keep loyalists involved in the movement? Why do people stay once they come into the movement? And in the materials that you've read for today, including especially the ethnography that Kathleen Blay has put together from different countries, these contributors find a very heterogeneous set of circumstances of organization, mobilization, and social background which lead to extremist activism. Here's how Kathleen Blay describes the far right, and I think this passage is worth quoting. There has been a resurgence of extreme right-wing and racist movements around the globe, even in places long regarded as models of ethnic and political tolerance. Far-right parties have garnered substantial numbers of votes in local and national elections in France, Austria, Italy, and Belgium, part of a larger mobilization of far-right movements in those nations. Neo-Nazi gangs and white power skinheads have been implicated in a rash of terroristic attacks on immigrants and Jews in Germany, Sweden, Canada, and elsewhere. And racial, ethnic, and religious supremacists, ranging from Hindu nationalists in India to white power movements in the United States, have fomented intergroup hatred and violence in various locales. This is setting the problem. What Kathleen Blay has done through her research and the research she has encouraged by other people is to try to give an anthropologist's understanding of what some of the motivations are and what the internal experience is of participants in these organizations and the nature of the events in which these adherents, these followers, and their mobilized activist friends and neighbors, what kind of experience do they have in the organization? Kathleen Blay has done a huge amount of research on racism and the extreme right, and she writes in these terms: intense activist racism typically does not arise on its own. It is learned in racist groups. These groups promote ideas radically different from the racist attitudes held by many whites. They teach a complex and contradictory mix of hatred for enemies, belief in conspiracies, and allegiance to an imaginary unified race of Aryans. This sounds like Nazi propaganda, but it also sounds like QAnon. It sounds like some very contemporary race-based and intolerant conspiratorial right-wing themes of mobilization which we see around us today. So there are two bodies of empirical research that I've asked you to read today. First, sociological studies of how far-right organizations and followers operate. This kind of detailed empirical investigation is very important if we're to understand the influence and the factors which lead to the growth of far-right organizations and sometimes their violent manifestations in attacks against despised groups. But secondly, anthropologists and ethnographers have now done interesting work on the followers of these kinds of organizations in a number of countries, and that's the collection from which you've read a couple of the articles. So first of all, in the review article by Blay and Cresap, this article I think is very useful for our purposes. It is a social science review article intended to introduce you to the current state of the field, the sociology of far-right organizations. The sociological study of extremist far-right movements is the topic of this review article. And the authors, Blay and Cresap, argue that the motivations and circumstances of mobilization into right-wing extremist organizations are substantially more heterogeneous than a simple story leading from racist attitudes to racist mobilization would suggest. In other words, it's a more indirect pathway from an individual who is in some indistinct way discontent with his or her circumstances and maybe some of the behaviors of people he sees around him to an active involvement in a racist organization. But what Blay and Cresap argue is that there are concrete mechanisms of recruitment and mobilization in play, which are very deliberately designed. They argue that antecedent racist ideology is a factor, but that music, culture, social media, and contingent social networks also play significant causal roles. And what they mean by contingent social networks is things like neighborhood groups and organizations which are organized around very different purposes, but which can be also vehicles for identifying like-minded people who also have contact with right-wing movements and organizations. Blay and Cresap point out that the far-right social phenomenon today is a network of social movements. There are multiple movements, multiple organizations, and that social movement theory of the sort associated with Doug McAdam, for example, has mostly been applied to progressive movements, but that these very same tools can be applied to conservative, right-wing movements, including the militia movement, which is so active here in the state of Michigan. Quoting from them, "Concepts from social movement theory have been valuable for directing attention to how rightist movements originate with movement entrepreneurs, how they frame their messages, respond to external political opportunities, forge collective identity, develop strategies and tactics, and serve as a source of vision and voice, however destructive, for their adherents." This is a nice quote because it singles out the key theoretical ideas of social movement theory, including the idea of movement entrepreneurs, messages, which unify and call to action, opportunities, which is a really crucial part of social movement theory, collective identities, the ways in which individuals are brought to see themselves as part of a movement or a group, and then strategies, vision, and voice. All of these ideas suggest lines of further empirical research. And so really what they're suggesting both is that there is an existing social science research area which is applying social movement theory to right-wing movements, and that there is lots of additional research which is still to be done. The role of movement entrepreneurs, the messages, the opportunities, and the strategies, vision, and voice, which are associated with right-wing extremist social movements. The role of culture and media really comes forward in many of the articles you've read and also in the review article. Quoting from one of the articles that you read for today, the music, family events, computer games, and amusement parks reached deep into mainstream America, bringing new social groups into politics. So did, and what they're referring to is a network of providers of right-wing, extremist, and racist media and games. So did its media empire, which began with radio and extended to book publishing houses, bookstores, televangelist, superstar preachers, and internet social networking sites. Such cultural projects helped to shape an identity for conservative evangelicals, distinct from both mainline Protestantism and other evangelicals. Blee and Creasap draw attention to the role of gender in conservative movements, and Blee has written in multiple contexts about the role of women in racist and white supremacist organizations in the United States. She has herself done what seems like really terrifying kinds of in-person research, going to events, mingling and interacting with people at Ku Klux Klan events and other kinds of extremist events. And what they document is lots of examples of women involved in conservative and extremist right-wing causes in the US, causes around anti-feminism, causes having to do with economic issues, and also evangelical themes, including the moral majority. There is, according to Kathleen Blay, a rising presence of women in extremist right-wing movements, which is somewhat surprising, she thinks, because the right-wing message is heavily masculinized. And you can see that from the videos that are associated with these groups now under indictment for threatening to kidnap our governor in the state of Michigan, and their highly testosterone-poisoned videos with their guns and their acting out of violent scenarios. What Blay finds is that in the US, women generally enter right-wing movements by being recruited to work for seemingly mainstream causes, such as school quality or community safety. And so what she sees is a kind of escalation of engagement from pretty routine kinds of social activism interest into more hate-based and racist kinds of organizations. Quoting from her, an analysis of an online skinhead community, for instance, found a widespread sentiment that true skinheads are hypermasculine, heterosexual men with shaved heads. Questions in the online forum about whether or not women could be involved in skinhead scenes were dismissed because, quote, only men are skinheads. A disturbing finding is that a significant number of young Europeans are supportive of the ideas and violent tactics of right-wing groups like skinheads in Great Britain and soccer hooligans in Europe, even when they are not themselves committed participants. In other words, the support for extremist right-wing organizations and their music and their cultural mobilizing cries, there is a broader range of support for them than the relatively limited numbers of overtly violent followers. So what are some of the factors which support the growth of right-wing movements around the world, in Europe, in Asia, and in North America? Factors which seem to influence right-wing growth have a lot to do with social competition, threat, and opportunity. At least this is a theory put forward by the sociologists who study these things. So economic competition and threat emerges as one of the factors which is favorable to the growth of right-wing organization and mobilization. The growth of patriot and militia groups in places where job losses are accumulating. So the protests and anger about globalization and the offshoring of jobs and so forth, and the subsequent growth of radical kind of underground organizations like militia groups. That's one of the associations which is drawn out by sociologists studying this material. But increasing populations of competing groups, where there's population change underway, whether it's East London or Youngstown, Ohio, where immigrants are moving in, minority groups are increasing, in earlier decades where more Catholics are suddenly present, this competition between an existing group of possibly white Protestant working class people and then other groups of working class people who are moving into their neighborhoods. This is thought to be a factor which may support right-wing mobilization. But then there's the issue of political opportunities. Quoting from Blay, political realignment spurred the growth of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which could point to the decline electoral influence of white, native-born Protestant men in the face of women's enfranchisement and the surge in immigration. So the political opportunity here is to, in the 1930s and 40s, to say to white Protestant men in the South, you're losing influence because women have the vote, their attitudes may erode your positions of privilege or economic position, and on top of that, there are more and more signs of political influence by people of color. That would be a political opportunity for mobilization by an organization like the Ku Klux Klan. Risk factors, which sometimes sociologists talk about the spread of political movements as being analogous to epidemiology or analogous to the spread of a disease. And so the idea of a risk factor is brought forward, the idea that it is a circumstance in an individual's conditions which make him or her more amenable to the call of right-wing extremism. And what are some of those risk factors? Well, social class is one. Family environment, having a situation where a teenager has an unhappy or a troubled or a violent home life. Trouble in school is thought to be a risk factor, and then neighborhood racial conflict is thought to be a risk factor for rising levels of interest in and support for extremist organizations like skinheads or violent racist groups. So what are some of the mobilization strategies and tools which we can see coming out of the materials that you've read? The use of music, and now we would say music videos and online music and violent video games and so forth, but also street clashes. Skinheads in Great Britain go out of their way to make use of violence against immigrants as a way not only of directly frightening and intimidating people of color in Great Britain, but also magnifying their own visibility and encouraging like-minded people to join them. Another context would be gun shows, but also community and neighborhood organizations where individuals come together for one set of issues and then wind up finding that they have common issues in these other more extremist issues as well. Prison is a place where racism gets activated and mobilized. So the question arises, do people join extremist groups because of their prior extremist beliefs, or do they join and then gain those right-wing beliefs? In other words, do the beliefs come first and membership second, or does some kind of casual engagement in the right-wing extremist organization then bring about the rise of the racist beliefs? And this is an active subject for research, but there is so much research now being done on the content of websites, blogs, social media, chat rooms, online discussion boards, and so forth. I think we now have a much better understanding of how racist ideas are spread through the internet and through these various social media sites and opportunities. And we can kind of think of a ladder of engagement from attendance at a kind of violent-laced music concert, a skinhead-based concert, to finding new friends, to getting deeper involvement in an organization, to finally joining an organization. Kathleen Blade distinguishes, this is a kind of a methodological distinction, but I think it's an important one and a meaningful one, the distinction between internalist and externalist approaches to the study of extremism. What she means by externalist is the idea that there are societal forces, risk factors that we've just been talking about, that contribute to the emergence of hate and racism within a population, and that we can study these factors in a general way. But she argues that an internalist approach is also needed to allow us to have a more nuanced understanding of the social and personal dynamics of extremist movements. And an internalist approach, according to her, aims at discovering the motives and causes of extremist engagement through study of the actors themselves within specific social circumstances. So doing first-person ethnographic and micro-sociological research. involved in conversation and in direct interview and study of the individuals who were involved. In the ethnographic issue that you read, the multinational ethnographic issue that you read, it's really all about the concrete situation and experience of individuals who are brought into hate-based organizations, nationalistic, xenophobic organizations, based on direct observation, interviews, participant observation, life history methods. And the scholars who have contributed to this volume find a mix of factors leading to the choice of extremist involvement. So there's adolescent hypermasculinity, there's a desire to belong, a history of bullying and abuse, as well as social exposure to adult hate activists. These are 4 different causal mechanisms for a young person with kind of vague personality qualities and personal experiences in life, which are then refined into a much more specifically hate-driven political consciousness and political identity. But the work is, of course, more difficult than other kinds of ethnographic research because of the secrecy, suspiciousness, and danger associated with these kinds of activism. It's worth just taking a few highlights from the essays out of the ethnography collection, but here's a highlight from Kimmel on Sweden. He writes, insecure and lonely at 12 years old, Edward started hanging out with skinheads because he had, quote, moved to a new town, knew nobody, needed friends. Equally lonely and utterly alienated from his distant father, Pele met an older skinhead who took him under his wing and became a sort of mentor. Pele was a, quote, street hooligan, hanging out in street gangs, brawling and drinking with other gangs. Quote, my group actually looked down on the neo-Nazis. They weren't real fighters. All the guys had an insecure role as a man, said Robert. They were all asking, who am I? So this kind of emphasizes the recruitment of adolescents and teenagers into right-wing street gangs or organizations based on their own personal insecurity and their need for a supportive environment, almost a new family, which can provide them with a sense of context and value. If we switch continents and look at the strategies of indoctrination in a Hindu nationalist, women-oriented camp, this is Segal's treatment of the Hindu nationalist organization that recruits and indoctrinates women. This article examines the discursive and embodied processes employed at Hindu nationalist paramilitary camps for women that transformed traditional middle-class Hindu women into committed, active participants in the powerful right-wing Hindu nationalist movement in India. And so the ethnographic research, which is described here, is really kind of frightening. It's a kind of process of brainwashing and exhaustion and authoritarian bullying of these young women, which pushes them into a much more violent attitude towards Muslims. The overall, I'm now quoting again from the article, the overall atmosphere of this camp and the Summitri's camps in general was rigid and authoritarian, with a strong emphasis on discipline. And it talks about the children, the girls, the young women, falling ill, exhaustion, heat stroke, desperately unhappy. And yet the longer-term developmental result is that these young women, these girls, eventually develop exactly the political and militant attitudes which the organizers of this process had intended, a kind of militant anti-Muslim activism. Turning to right-wing recruitment in organizations in Germany, here the emphasis is on festivals and music, the role that music plays. And I found this quote quite interesting. Festivals are excellent opportunities for far-right groups to spread the word about their successes to like-minded activists and sympathizers, since visitors come from as far away as Italy to see white power music bands. In the festival mentioned here, a folk dance art in the act in the afternoon attracted only a few hundred spectators, but evening performances by the U.S. band Youngland drew a large crowd that pushed to the front of the stage, leaving only limited space for burly skinheads indulging in pogo dancing. The music created a ritual closeness and attachment among the audience, shaping the emotions and aggressions of the like-minded crowd, initially in a playful way, but one that switched into brutality a few minutes later. This is illuminating because it really talks about the role that emotion and the evoking of emotions in prospective followers, the role that emotional appeal plays in the recruitment process. And the last example I wanted to give is this kind of analysis of different profiles of adherents in far-right organizations, where Linden and Klendersmans for the Netherlands talk about the ways in which men and women navigate their way into right-wing organizations. Their research is interesting because it's based on extensive life history interviews with extreme right activists in the Netherlands. And their goal through these interviews, these 3-hour-plus long interviews, is to understand why these individuals made the choices that they did. I myself think that this is such an interesting process, and how interesting it would be to be able to sit in on these interviews and just kind of hear what people say about their involvement. So each of the essays in this volume, the ethnography volume, these essays are based on first-hand observation and interaction, and they're intended to give insight into the psychological forces that play on the participants, as well as the mobilizational strategies used by the leaders of these kinds of movements. And the collection is valuable because it gives us kind of a broad basis for understanding how we can do empirical research, how it is possible for social scientists to try to get a better understanding of how right-wing extremism actually works as a social movement and as a way of recruiting people with a wide variety of discontent and unhappiness in their personal lives and their social lives, and mobilize those individuals into a movement with a fairly simple message: xenophobic, racist, anti-elites, and populist. And the role that emotion plays in these efforts is really quite noteworthy. So thank you, and I look forward to talking about some of these ideas when we discuss.